In June 1938, the Yellow River turned into a weapon. Not by nature, not by accident, by human hands. Chinese military engineers stood at the dikes near Jiangsu with explosives. They weren't stopping an enemy army from crossing. They were about to drown their own people. Hundreds of thousands of them. The order came from the top: break the dikes, flood 3 provinces, stop the Japanese advance at any cost. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what came after the water receded. This is the story of one of history's deadliest military decisions, a flood that killed more civilians than most battles of World War II, a flood that's been scrubbed from textbooks, buried in propaganda, and forgotten by the world. What happened next still haunts their survivors who remain. The Yellow River flood of 1938 killed somewhere between 400,000 and 900,000 people. Let that number sit for a moment. That's more than the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, combined. And yet, most people have never heard of it. Why? Because it doesn't fit neatly into the heroic narratives we tell about World War II. Because it was done by the good guys, the Chinese nationalist forces resisting Japanese invasion. Because admitting it meant admitting that sometimes, in war, your own government becomes the killer. The Japanese were advancing fast in 1938. They'd taken Shanghai, they'd taken Nanjing, where they committed unspeakable atrocities. Now they were pushing inland toward the heart of China. Chiang Kai-shek and his generals were desperate. They needed time. They needed something, anything to slow the Japanese war machine. So they looked at a map, and they saw the Yellow River. For centuries, the Chinese called it China's sorrow. It flooded naturally, drowning villages, destroying crops, reshaping the landscape. It was unpredictable, deadly. But in 1938, they decided to make it a weapon. The plan was simple on paper: blow the dikes, flood the plains, create a massive water barrier the Japanese couldn't cross. The cost? 3 provinces underwater, millions of people in the flood zone. They did it anyway. And this is where things became terrifying. June 5, 1938, Huayuankou near Jiangsu. Farmers were in the fields. Children played near the river. It was early summer. The wheat was almost ready for harvest. No one knew what was about to happen. Chinese military engineers had been working quietly for days. They told locals they were reinforcing the dikes, strengthening them against potential Japanese bombing. It was a lie. At night, they planted explosives along a section of the dike. The first detonation happened just after midnight on June 9th. It failed. The dike cracked but didn't break. Water seeped through, but not enough. The engineers tried again. More explosives, a bigger charge. June 11th, second attempt. This time, it worked. The dike exploded. A wall of water, 15 feet high in some places, roared across the plains. Farmers heard it first, a sound like thunder, but constant, growing louder. By the time they saw it, it was too late. Entire villages vanished in minutes. People climbed trees, rooftops, anything above the water. But the current was so strong it ripped trees out by the roots. Rooftops collapsed under the weight of desperate families. One survivor, a woman named Liu Xiying, who was 12 at the time, later recalled, "We heard shouting. My father grabbed me and ran. The water came so fast, it swallowed our house. I saw our neighbors swept away like leaves. I held on to my father's back as he swam. I never saw my mother again." The flood spread across 3 provinces, Henan, Anhui, and Jiangsu. 11 cities, 4,000 villages, gone. Within hours, the Chinese nationalist government made a decision: blame the Japanese. Radio broadcasts went out. Newspapers printed the story. Japanese bombers destroy Yellow River dikes. Massive flooding kills thousands. It was a complete fabrication. But it worked. For a while. The international press picked it up. The New York Times, the London papers, they all reported it as a Japanese atrocity. Chiang Kai-shek's government needed the world to see Japan as the villain. And in many ways, Japan was. The horrors of Nanjing were real. The brutality of the invasion was undeniable. But this flood? This was different. Local survivors knew the truth. They'd seen Chinese soldiers at the dikes. They'd heard the explosions. They watched as their own military fled before the flood hit, because they knew it was coming. But who would believe them? The government controlled the narrative, and questioning it could get you killed. So people stayed silent, and the lie spread. The flood didn't stop after the first day. The Yellow River had been unleashed. It carved new channels. It merged with other rivers. It turned fertile farmland into a vast, muddy sea. For weeks, the water kept spreading. Refugee camps formed on higher ground. Tens of thousands of people crowded together with nothing. No food, no clean water, no shelter. Disease came next. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid. Bodies floated in the floodwaters. Corpses of people, livestock, everything. The stench was unbearable. A Red Cross worker documented the scene. There is no dry land for miles. The living cling to rooftops and trees. The dead drift past them. Children cry for parents who are gone. Old people simply let go and slipped into the water. There is no hope here, only waiting. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the hunger. The flood hit just before harvest season. Entire grain stores were destroyed. The fields, now underwater, wouldn't produce crops for years. Famine was coming, and it would kill far more than the flood itself. When the flood hit, families had seconds to react. Some grabbed their children and ran. Others froze, unable to comprehend what was happening. In the chaos, people were separated. Parents lost children in the current. Siblings were swept in different directions. Husbands and wives were torn apart, never to see each other again. Refugee camps became places of desperate searching. Every day, people walked through the camps calling out names, holding up photographs, describing missing loved ones. "Have you seen my daughter? She's 8. She was wearing a blue coat. My husband, he's a farmer. Tall, scar on his left hand." Most searches ended in silence. One man, Zhang Wei, spent 3 years searching for his wife and 2 sons. He walked from camp to camp, village to village. He never found them. In 1941, he finally stopped looking. "I realized," he said years later, "that I was searching for ghosts." The flood didn't just kill people. It erased them. Entire family lines ended in a single night. Villages with centuries of history vanished. Names, stories, memories, all washed away. And history barely mentions what happened next. By July 1938, an estimated 10 million people were displaced. 10 million. They became refugees in their own country. They walked for weeks, carrying whatever they could. Elderly people collapsed on the roads. Children died of starvation before reaching safety. The Nationalist government set up relief stations, but they were overwhelmed. There wasn't enough food, medicine, or shelter. And the government's priority wasn't relief. It was maintaining the lie. Officials at refugee camps were instructed to tell survivors the Japanese did this. Some survivors believed it. Others knew better, but stayed silent. One elderly farmer, Chun Lao, later testified, "They told us the Japanese bombed the dikes, but I was there. I saw our own soldiers. I saw them running away before the water came. I knew. But what could I say? If I spoke, They'd call me a traitor, so I said nothing. The refugees scattered across China. Some eventually returned to find their villages gone, completely erased by the flood. The river carved new paths. The land was unrecognizable. Others never went back. They built new lives in distant provinces, carrying the trauma in silence. Their children grew up hearing only fragments of the story, and slowly the memory faded. In the village of Huayuankou, ground zero of the breach, nearly everyone died. The explosion happened at night. The water came so fast that most people drowned in their sleep. Those who woke up had minutes, maybe less. One survivor, a young boy named Li Ming, described it. I woke to my mother screaming. The house was filling with water. My father tried to open the door, but the current was too strong. The walls collapsed. I remember grabbing onto a piece of wood. I remember seeing my little sister. She couldn't swim. She reached for me, and then she was gone. Li Ming drifted for 2 days on that piece of wood. He watched bodies float past. He heard screaming in the distance, then silence. When he finally reached dry land, he was alone. Huayuankou had a population of over 3,000 before the flood. Fewer than 200 survived. The village itself ceased to exist. The river swallowed it completely. When researchers tried to locate it decades later, they found nothing. No ruins, no markers, just empty land where a community once lived. Children were among the most vulnerable. They couldn't swim as well as adults. They couldn't hold on as long. They couldn't survive the cold water for hours. Mothers made impossible choices. Do you grab your youngest child or your oldest? Do you try to save them both and risk losing everyone? One mother, Wang Mei, later recalled, "I had 3 children. When the water came, I grabbed my baby. My 2 older sons, 7 and 9, they tried to follow, but the current was too strong. I watched them get swept away. I screamed their names until my voice was gone, but I couldn't let go of the baby. I couldn't." Wang Mei survived with her infant daughter. She never saw her sons again. Thousands of children drowned in the first hours. Thousands more died in the days and weeks that followed from exposure, hunger, disease. Refugee camps were filled with orphans. Children who'd watched their entire families drown. Children who wandered alone, crying for parents who would never answer. Aid workers tried to help, but there were too many. The camps couldn't handle the volume of trauma. Many orphans were eventually taken in by distant relatives or strangers. Others ended up in overcrowded orphanages. Some simply disappeared. No records, no names, no graves. Just gone. When the flood hit, people climbed. Trees, rooftops, anything above the water. But the water didn't recede quickly. For days, sometimes weeks, survivors clung to their perches, waiting for rescue that often never came. They had no food, no clean water, no shelter from the sun or rain. Rescue boats couldn't reach everyone. The military prioritized certain areas, wealthy districts, strategic locations. Rural villages, they were left to wait. One man, Zhao Jun, spent 6 days in a tree with his wife and elderly father. "We took turns sleeping," he said. "We had to hold each other so no one would fall. My father was weak. On the 4th day, he stopped talking. On the 5th day, he let go." Zhao watched his father slip into the water. He and his wife survived, but he never forgave himself for not being able to save his father. Others weren't so lucky. Entire families died together in trees, dehydrated, starving, exposed. When rescue crews finally arrived weeks later, they found corpses still clinging to branches. And this is where things became even terrifying. The refugee camps became death traps. overcrowded, unsanitary, surrounded by contaminated water. Cholera spread first. It moved through the camps like wildfire. People who survived the flood died vomiting and convulsing in makeshift tents. Then came dysentery, typhoid, malaria. Medical supplies were scarce. Doctors were overwhelmed. Mass graves were dug daily. Families who'd escaped the flood watched loved ones die slowly from disease. One nurse, Sister Mary Chen, a Catholic missionary, documented the horror. "We are burying 50 people a day, maybe more. We've run out of coffins. We wrap them in cloth. Sometimes we don't even have that. Children are dying in their mother's arms. I pray, but I don't know if God hears me anymore." The camps remained operational for years. Even after the water receded, people had nowhere to go. Their villages were gone. Their land was poisoned. By 1940, disease had killed an estimated 200,000 additional people. The flood was the initial blow, but disease finished the job. In the most desperate camps, hunger drove people to madness. There are documented reports, though suppressed by the government, of cannibalism. Starving refugees turned on the dead, in some cases the dying. One account from a foreign journalist, later censored, described finding evidence of human remains being cooked in a remote camp. The survivors wouldn't speak of it, but the bones told the story, he wrote. This isn't confirmed in all areas, but multiple sources, missionaries, Red Cross workers, foreign reporters, mention whispers of it. Starvation does terrible things to the human mind. People who would never imagine such horror found themselves facing a choice: die or do the unthinkable. Most chose to die, but not all. The Chinese government has never officially acknowledged these reports. They remain buried in archives, classified documents, and the fading memories of those who were there. As the death toll mounted, the nationalist government doubled down on the lie. They couldn't admit the truth, not while fighting a war, not while seeking international support. So they buried it. Documents were destroyed. Witnesses were silenced. Survivors who spoke out were labeled traitors or Japanese sympathizers. Journalists who investigated too closely were expelled from the country. The official narrative remained: Japanese aggression caused the flood. Even after the war, when the truth began to surface, the government refused to acknowledge it. Chiang Kai-shek's regime fell in 1949. The communists took over, and they had no interest in highlighting nationalist atrocities. So the story stayed buried. For decades, Chinese citizens weren't taught about it. It wasn't in textbooks. It wasn't discussed publicly. It became a ghost story. A tragedy so immense, so uncomfortable, that both sides of China's civil war agreed to forget it. But the survivors never forgot. Let's go back to the moment the order was given. June 1938, Chiang Kai-shek's headquarters. The Japanese were advancing rapidly. Suzhou had fallen. Zhuangzhou was next. If Zhuangzhou fell, the route to Wuhan, China's wartime capital, would be wide open. Chiang's advisors presented options. All of them were bad. One general suggested a tactical retreat, regroup further west. Another proposed a last stand, defend Zhuangzhou to the death. And then someone brought up the Yellow River. What if we flood the plains, force the Japanese to halt their advance, buy ourselves time? The room went silent. Everyone understood what that meant. Millions of Chinese civilians lived in the flood zone. Most were peasants, farmers, people with no connection to the war except that it was destroying their lives. Chiang asked the obvious question: how many will die? The estimates varied. Tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands. But they didn't really know. And here's the key: they didn't try to find out.
There was no evacuation plan, no warning to civilians, no attempt to minimize casualties. Chiang made the decision. Do it. Years later, after the war, Chiang defended the decision in his memoirs. It was a military necessity. The Japanese had to be stopped. Sacrifices had to be made. He never apologized. He never acknowledged the full scale of the death toll. To him, it was a tactical success. The flood did slow the Japanese advance for a few months. But at what cost? The Chinese soldiers tasked with blowing the dike knew what they were doing. They weren't mindless automatons. They were men, many of them from the same provinces they were about to drown. Some refused to participate. They were court-martialed, shot. Others carried out the orders, but were haunted for the rest of their lives. One engineer, Captain Liu Chong, later defected to the Communists. In a rare interview in the 1950s, he said, "I planted the explosives. I set the charges. I knew what would happen. I told myself it was for China, that we were saving the country. But when I heard the screams afterward, I knew I'd committed a sin I could never wash away." Captain Liu committed suicide in 1956. His suicide note mentioned the flood. He wrote, "I see their faces every night, the children, the mothers. They won't leave me alone." Many of the soldiers involved never spoke of it. They buried the memory and carried the guilt in silence. Not all villages were caught by surprise. In some areas, rumors spread before the flood hit. One village, Huayuankou, heard rumors that the dikes were going to be breached. The village elder called a meeting. They had a choice: flee immediately with whatever they could carry, or stay and hope the rumors were false. Some families left, others stayed. "This is our home," one farmer said. "We've survived floods before. We'll survive this one." They were wrong. When the flood hit Huayuankou, the water was 20 feet deep. The village was obliterated. Of the 120 families who stayed, only a handful survived. One woman, Chu Lien, had left with her children the day before the flood. Her husband and his parents stayed behind. She never saw them again. "I begged him to come," she said. "I told him something terrible was going to happen. He said I was being hysterical, that I was letting fear control me. He was a proud man. He couldn't imagine our own government would do this to us." Chu Lien lived to be 94. She never returned to the site of Huayuankou. She said, "There's nothing there, just ghosts." In the chaos after the flood, society broke down. Refugees were desperate, starving, willing to do anything to survive. Looting became rampant. Abandoned homes were stripped bare. Shops were raided. Even corpses were searched for valuables. Gangs formed in the refugee camps. They controlled food distribution. They extorted the weak. They assaulted women. The nationalist government had no resources to maintain order. Police and military were focused on the war with Japan. The refugee camps were left largely ungoverned. One survivor, a teenage girl named Mei Lin, described being attacked. "3 men came to our tent at night. They took our food. My mother tried to stop them. They beat her. I thought they would kill us. But another group of refugees heard the noise and chased them off. We were lucky." Not everyone was. Reports of rape, murder, and violence were common, but no one was prosecuted. There was no justice, no accountability. The flood had created a lawless wasteland, and the strong preyed on the weak.
Amid the horror, there were acts of extraordinary courage. Father Thomas O'Reilly was an Irish Catholic missionary stationed in Henan province. When the flood hit, most foreign nationals evacuated. Father O'Reilly refused to leave. He stayed with the refugees. He set up a makeshift hospital in a partially collapsed church. He treated the sick with whatever supplies he could scrounge.
He buried the dead. He worked 18-hour days every day for 2 years. In letters to his family back in Ireland, he wrote, "I cannot leave these people. They have lost everything. If I go, who will stay? The government has abandoned them. The world has forgotten them. I will not." Father O'Reilly died in 1940 of typhoid fever. He was 38 years old. The refugees buried him near the church. For years afterward, survivors would bring flowers to his grave. He was one of the few who stayed when everyone else ran. Her name was Sun Mei. She was 26 when the flood hit. She had a husband, 2 young sons, and her elderly mother living with her. When the water came, they all climbed onto the roof of their house. For 3 days they held on. On the 4th day, the roof collapsed. Sun Mei's husband grabbed their youngest son and tried to swim to a nearby tree. He didn't make it. Sun Mei watched them both drown. Her older son and her mother was swept away when the roof gave out. Sun Mei clung to a piece of debris for another day before being rescued. She was the only survivor from her entire family. At the refugee camp, she stopped speaking. Aid workers tried to help her, but she wouldn't eat, wouldn't engage. She sat in silence, staring at nothing. After 2 weeks, she walked into the floodwaters and didn't come back. Her body was never found. In the midst of the disaster, ordinary people did extraordinary things. Chen Da was a fisherman. He lived near the Yellow River his entire life. He knew its moods, its currents, its dangers. When the flood hit, Chen grabbed his boat, a small wooden vessel, and started rescuing people. For 2 weeks he worked non-stop. He pulled drowning families from the water. He ferried refugees to higher ground. He saved over 200 people. He didn't ask for payment. He didn't care about recognition. He just rowed. One woman he saved, Huang Li, later said, "He appeared out of nowhere. My children and I were clinging to a piece of roof. We were so tired. I was ready to let go. Then I heard his voice. 'Hold on, I'm coming.' He pulled us into his boat. He gave us water. He took us to safety. I never even learned his name." Chen Da died in 1943, not from the flood, but from malaria contracted while helping refugees. He was buried in an unmarked grave. No monuments, no statues, just the memories of those he saved. When the flood hit the village of Li Hua, the village elder drowned immediately. Panic spread. A 17-year-old boy named Wang Jun took charge. He organized the survivors. He sent the strongest swimmers to rescue those trapped in trees. He rationed the small amount of food they had. He kept people calm. Under his leadership, 80% of Li Hua's population survived, one of the highest survival rates in the region. When government officials finally arrived, they were shocked to find the village so well organized. They asked who was in charge. Wang Jun stepped forward. The officials didn't believe him at first. He was just a boy. But the villagers insisted. He saved us. He kept us alive. Wang Jun was later conscripted into the National Army. He died in battle in 1942. He was 21. Miss Jiang taught at a rural primary school near the flood zone. When the water started rising, she was with her class, 32 children, ages 6 to 12. The school was a single-story building. It flooded quickly. Miss Jiang got the children onto the roof, but the roof was weak. It wouldn't last for long. She made a decision. She tied the children together with rope, forming a human chain. She put the strongest swimmers at the front and back. Then she led them into the water. They swam and floated for over a mile, heading towards higher ground. 3 children drowned along the way, but Miss Jiang saved 29. When they reached safety, she collapsed from exhaustion. She woke up 3 days later in a refugee camp. The children she saved never forgot her. Decades later, survivors tracked her down. She was living in poverty, forgotten by the government. They pooled their money and supported her for the rest of her life. One of her former students said, "She taught us more in that one day than in all the years in the classroom. She taught us to never give up."
After the water receded, some people returned to find their villages completely gone. Guo Wei was one of them. His entire village, everyone he knew, was dead. The land was barren. The river had carved a new path, leaving behind only mud and debris. Most survivors moved on, started over somewhere else. Not Guo Wei. He stayed. For 5 years, he worked alone. He cleared the land, he rebuilt a small house, he planted crops in soil that had been poisoned by the flood. Slowly, the land recovered. Other survivors heard about him. A few returned to help. By 1945, the village had 20 people. By 1950, over 100. Guo Wei became the village elder. He lived to be 89. When asked why he stayed, he said, "This is where my family is buried. I couldn't leave them alone." In the aftermath, food was scarce. The government's relief efforts were inadequate. Corruption was rampant. Food meant for refugees was often stolen and sold on the black market. A group of smugglers, criminals technically, saw an opportunity. But they didn't exploit it for profit. They used their networks to smuggle food into the refugee camps, not out. They bypassed corrupt officials, they sourced grain from unaffected provinces, they distributed it directly to starving families. One of the smugglers, a man known only as Old Peng, later explained, "We were criminals, yes, but we weren't monsters. These were our people, our countrymen. We had boats, we had connections, we could help, so we did." Old Peng and his crew saved an estimated 5,000 people from starvation. They were never thanked. In fact, after the war, several were arrested for their smuggling activities. Old Peng died in prison in 1952. But the families he saved remembered. For some children, the refugee camps became their entire childhood. They didn't remember life before the flood. They grew up in tents, surrounded by trauma and loss. These children formed bonds with each other. They created games, routines, small moments of joy in the bleakness. One girl, Xiao Hua, later recalled, "We didn't have toys, we didn't have school, but we had each other. We'd tell stories, we'd sing songs our mothers taught us, we'd pretend things were normal." Many of these children never left the camps. Even after the war ended, they had nowhere to go, no family, no home. They became a lost generation. Some were eventually adopted. Others ended up in state-run institutions. A few simply disappeared into the chaos of post-war China. Their stories were never recorded. Their names were never remembered. Dr. Liang was a physician in Kaifeng. When the flood hit, he immediately set up a field hospital. He worked 20-hour days. He treated cholera, typhoid, infected wounds, malnutrition. He had almost no supplies. He improvised. He boiled instruments in floodwater. He made bandages from torn clothing. He saved hundreds of lives. But he couldn't save himself. In August 1938, Dr. Liang contracted cholera from a patient. He continued working even as he grew weaker. On his last day, he collapsed while treating a child. He died hours later. He was 42. The refugees buried him near the hospital. They carved his name into a piece of wood and placed it at the grave. Dr. Liang. He stayed. Wang Shu had 3 children. In the refugee camp, food rations were meager,
barely enough to survive. Every day, Wang Shu gave her portion to her children. She told them she'd already eaten, that she wasn't hungry. She lied. For weeks, she starved herself so her children could live. By September, she was too weak to stand. Her children begged her to eat. She refused. She died in October 1938. Her children survived. They never forgot what she did. One of her sons, now in his 90s, still cries when he talks about her. She gave us everything, even her life.
Private Zhao was stationed with the Nationalist army when the flood happened. His orders were clear: continue fighting the Japanese, ignore the refugees. But Private Zhao's family was from Henan province. He knew they were in the flood zone. He deserted. He went AWOL and spent 3 months searching for them. He never found them. But along the way, he helped dozens of other families. He shared his rations. He carried children who couldn't walk. He used his military training to organize rescue efforts. He was eventually caught and marshal-courted. He was executed in 1939. His last words were, "I'd do it again." A Chinese journalist named Wu Jian suspected the government was lying about the flood. He started investigating quietly. He interviewed survivors. He talked to engineers. He gathered evidence. In 1940, he published an article in a small independent newspaper, "The Truth About the Yellow River Flood." In it, he detailed the nationalist government's role in the disaster. He named names. He exposed the cover-up. The government shut down the newspaper within days. Wu Jian was arrested. He was never seen again. But copies of his articles survived. They were passed hand to hand, hidden in homes, whispered about in secret. Decades later, historians would use his work to piece together the truth. Wu Jian died for the truth, and most people never knew his name. An American diplomat stationed in China, John Caldwell, witnessed the aftermath of the flood. He was horrified. He sent reports back to Washington, urging the U.S. government to provide aid. His reports were ignored. America was focused on its own issues. The Depression was still being felt. Europe was on the brink of war. China's internal disaster wasn't a priority. Caldwell didn't give up. He used his own money to buy food and medicine. He organized private relief efforts among the foreign community in China. He saved hundreds of lives. But it cost him his career. His superiors reprimanded him for overstepping his duties. He was reassigned in 1940. He left China heartbroken. In his final report, he wrote, "History will judge us for what we did not do." In a small village in Henan, there lived a woman named Grandmother Wu. She was 65 when the flood hit. She survived by clinging to a door for 2 days until fishermen found her. Her husband, 3 sons, 2 daughters-in-law, and 7 grandchildren all drowned. She was the last of her family. After the flood, Grandmother Wu did something remarkable. She started writing everything down. She couldn't write well. She'd had only 2 years of schooling as a child. Her handwriting was shaky. Her grammar was poor. But she wrote anyway. Every day she recorded what she remembered: the names of people who died, the names of villages that disappeared, the dates, the details. She filled dozens of notebooks. She interviewed other survivors. She collected their stories. She preserved memories that would have otherwise been lost. The government tried to take her notebooks once. She refused. "These are the voices of the dead," she told them. "You cannot silence them." She hid the notebooks in her home, buried them in walls, gave copies to trusted friends. Grandmother Wu died in 1978 at the age of 105. Her notebooks survived. In the 1980s, when China began acknowledging the truth about the flood, her writings became one of the most important primary sources. Historians called her work invaluable. One historian wrote, "Grandmother Wu did what the government refused to do. She remembered." In 1985, survivors returned to the site of Huayuankou, the village where the dike was breached. They wanted to build a memorial. The government initially refused permission, but the survivors persisted. They raised money privately. They organized quietly. In 1988, on the 50th anniversary of the flood, they erected a small stone monument. It bore a simple inscription, "In memory of those who died in the Yellow River flood, 1938. We will not forget." No mention of who caused it, no political statement, just remembrance. Today, that monument still stands, but most Chinese citizens don't know it exists. It's not on tourist maps, it's not in guidebooks. You have to know where to look. But the families of survivors know. Every year, on the anniversary, a few elderly people make the journey. They place flowers, they burn incense, they speak the names of the dead. One elderly man, a survivor now in his 90s, said, "The government wants us to forget, but we cannot. If we forget, they died for nothing." The flood didn't just kill people immediately. It destroyed the entire agricultural base of 3 provinces. The Yellow River Plains were some of the most fertile land in China. They produced grain that fed millions. After the flood, the land was poisoned. Salt from the floodwaters made the soil infertile. Silt deposits buried fields under feet of mud. Irrigation systems were destroyed. It would take years, sometimes decades, for the land to recover. In the meantime, famine set in. The 1938 to 1942 period became known as the Henan famine. An estimated 2 to 3 million people died, not from the flood itself, but from starvation caused by the flood. Families ate tree bark, they boiled grass, they consumed anything remotely edible. There are documented cases of parents selling children just so those children might have a chance to eat. One survivor, now deceased, described seeing a mother holding her dead baby. She wouldn't let go. We tried to take the body to bury it, but she screamed, "Not yet, not yet." She thought if she held on long enough, the baby would wake up. She was starving. She was mad with grief. The famine killed slowly. People wasted away over months. Their bodies consumed themselves, and the world barely noticed. China was at war. The world was heading toward global conflict. A famine in central China wasn't news. It was just another tragedy in a country full of them. The flood didn't just affect people. It fundamentally changed the landscape. The Yellow River carved new channels. It abandoned old ones. Entire ecosystems were destroyed. Forests were uprooted. Wildlife habitats vanished. Fish populations collapsed. The river's course shifted so dramatically that maps became obsolete. Towns that were once riverside found themselves miles from water. Other towns that were inland suddenly had a river running through them. The environmental recovery took decades. Some areas never fully recovered. Today, if you look at geological surveys of the region, you can still see the scars. The soil composition is different. The drainage patterns are irregular. The land remembers, even if people have forgotten. Many survivors carried the trauma in silence for their entire lives. They never told their children what happened. They never spoke of the dead. They buried it deep and tried to move on. Why? Some were afraid that talking about it would get them in trouble politically.
Others simply couldn't bear to relive it. And some felt guilt, survivor's guilt. Why did I live when my family died? Why was I saved when my neighbor drowned? What did I deserve to survive? These questions haunted them. One woman, interviewed in the 1990s when she was in her 80s, broke down crying, "I've never told anyone this. My sister drowned, saving me. She pushed me onto a piece of wood and told me to hold on. She couldn't get on herself. There wasn't room for both of us. She let go. She chose to die so I could live, and I've hated myself for it every day since." That guilt ate at survivors. It shaped their entire lives. Many became withdrawn, depressed, unable to form close relationships because they feared losing people again. The flood didn't just kill the dead, it killed parts of the living too. After 1949, when the communists took power in China, the Yellow River flood became a political tool. The new government used it to discredit the nationalists. Look what they did. They murdered their own people, which was true. But the communists weren't interested in justice for the victims. They were interested in political advantage. Survivors weren't compensated. They weren't honored. They were used. Communist Party officials would parade survivors in front of cameras. "Tell us how the nationalists destroyed your life." If survivors didn't say the right things, they were punished. One survivor refused to condemn Chiang Kai-shek in a public rally. He was labeled a counter-revolutionary and sent to a labor camp. He died there in 1953. The flood became a propaganda weapon, wielded by both sides. The nationalists, now in Taiwan, denied it. The communists exaggerated it. The truth was lost in the middle. And the survivors, the actual victims, were forgotten by both governments. The children of survivors grew up in households haunted by ghosts. Their parents rarely spoke of the flood, but the trauma was there. It manifested in strange ways. Parents who hoarded food, terrified of starvation. Parents who panicked during rainstorms. Parents who wouldn't let their children near rivers or lakes. One woman, the daughter of a survivor, recalled, "My mother never explained why she was the way she was. She just was. She'd wake up screaming at night. She'd clutch me and my siblings and cry. When I got older and asked her about it, she'd shut down. Don't ask me that. Never ask me that." The second generation carried trauma they didn't understand. They inherited pain without context, and many of them only learned the truth after their parents died. Finding old documents, hearing stories from relatives, piecing together fragments. By then, it was too late to ask questions. The generation that lived through it was nearly gone. And with them, the full truth.
While Chinese records were destroyed or suppressed, foreign records survived. Missionaries kept diaries. Diplomats wrote reports. Journalists took photographs. These documents ended up in archives around the world. The Vatican Library, the U.S. National Archives, the British Library. In the 1980s and 1990s, historians began accessing these records. They found eyewitness accounts, casualty estimates, photos of the devastation. One particularly haunting photo, taken by a German journalist, shows a tree filled with corpses. People who'd climbed up to escape the flood and died there, still clinging to the branches. The photo was never published at the time. Too graphic. It sat in an archive for 50 years. When it finally surfaced, it shocked the world. How did we not know about this, people asked. Because it was deliberately hidden. Because it was inconvenient. Because the dead were peasants, not politicians. Because history is written by those in power, not by those who suffer. In 1982, a university student in Beijing named Chen Wei was researching his family history. His grandmother had always been vague about her past. She'd say only that she came from Henan
and lost people in the war. Chen Wei wanted to know more. He started digging through local records. He interviewed elderly relatives. He searched for his grandmother's village on maps. He couldn't find it. The village didn't exist anymore. That's when he stumbled onto references to the 1938 Yellow River disaster. He was shocked. He'd never heard of it. He asked his professors. They were evasive. That's a complicated topic, perhaps best left alone. But Chen Wei wouldn't let it go. He spent years researching. He tracked down survivors. He accessed foreign archives. In 1987, he published a paper, The Forgotten Flood, a re-examination of the 1938 Yellow River disaster. It caused a minor sensation in academic circles. The government didn't censor it, but they didn't promote it either. Chen Wei's work became one of the first Chinese-authored accounts of the flood that told the truth. He died in 2019. In his obituary, survivors thanked him. He gave voice to the voiceless. He remembered when the nation wanted to forget. In 1998, a Chinese filmmaker tried to make a documentary about the flood. He interviewed survivors, he visited the sites, he compiled footage and photographs. The documentary was titled The River of Sorrow. It was powerful, devastating, honest. It showed the nationalist government's role. It didn't shy away from the death toll. When he submitted it for approval, the government banned it. Too sensitive, they said. The filmmaker was told to destroy all copies. He didn't. He smuggled a copy out of China. It was shown at a film festival in Hong Kong. The Chinese government was furious. The filmmaker was blacklisted. He couldn't work in China anymore. He eventually emigrated to the United States. The documentary still can't be shown in mainland China, but it exists online, in fragments passed around on underground forums. Survivors who've seen it say, finally, someone told the truth. To this day, the Chinese government has never officially apologized for the flood. They've acknowledged it happened. They've allowed limited discussion of it. But there's been no formal apology, no compensation for survivors or descendants, no national memorial. Why? Because admitting full responsibility would open uncomfortable questions. Questions about accountability, about government negligence, about whether leaders should face consequences for decisions that kill civilians. The Communist Party, despite being a different government than the one that caused the flood, doesn't want to set that precedent. If the Nationalists should be held accountable for the flood, what about communist policies that caused mass death? The Great Leap Forward famine in 1959 to 1961 killed tens of millions. The Cultural Revolution caused widespread suffering. If you start acknowledging historical atrocities, where does it stop? So the government treads carefully. They allow academic discussion. They don't actively suppress survivor stories anymore, but they won't go further. One Chinese historian, speaking anonymously, said, "The government's position is, yes, it happened. Yes, it was terrible. Now let's move on." They want controlled memory, not true reckoning. In 2008, on the 70th anniversary of the flood, survivors organized a gathering. Most were in their 80s and 90s, some were over 100. They came from across China and even from abroad, descendants of survivors who'd emigrated. They met at Huayuankou, the site where the dike was breached. There were fewer than 200 of them, the last living witnesses. They stood by the memorial stone. They shared stories. They cried. Many hadn't talked about the flood for decades, but here, surrounded by others who understood, they opened up. "I've been silent for 70 years. I thought I'd die without ever speaking of it, but I need to say their names. I need someone to know they existed." She listed her family members, her parents, her siblings, her husband, her children, all drowned. Others did the same. It became a roll call of the dead, thousands of names spoken aloud. A young journalist covering the event later wrote, "I've never witnessed anything like it. These elderly people, most of whom had been silent their entire lives, finally speaking, finally mourning. It felt like the ghosts were listening, like the dead were finally being honored. That gathering was the last of its kind. Most of those survivors have since died. The flood is now passing from living memory into history. Soon, there will be no one left who remembers.
The grandchildren and great-grandchildren of survivors are now the keepers of the memory. Some have taken it seriously. They've researched their family histories. They've visited the sites. They've written down what their elders told them. One woman, Li Hua, created an online memorial. It's a website where people can post stories of family members who died in the flood. Over 10,000 names have been added. Each entry includes a name, a photo if available, and a story. My great-grandfather, Liu Chen, he was a farmer. He died saving his neighbors. My grandmother's sister, Mei Ling, she was 9 years old. She drowned holding her mother's hand. It's become a digital graveyard, a place where the dead are finally being remembered. Li Hua says, "The government won't build a memorial, so we will, online, where it can't be torn down or censored. These names will live forever." The stated purpose of the flood was military, slow the Japanese advance. Did it work? Yes and no. The flood did create a massive barrier. The Japanese advance toward Wuhan was delayed by several months, but it didn't stop them. By October 1938, the Japanese had found ways around the flood. They took Wuhan anyway. So the flood bought time, about 3 to 4 months. Was it worth it? Hundreds of thousands of civilians dead, millions displaced, years of famine and suffering for 3 months. Even military historians are divided. Some argue it was a necessary sacrifice in total war. Others call it a catastrophic miscalculation. General Chiang himself seemed conflicted. In his later writings, he defended the decision but acknowledged the cost. War demands terrible choices. I made the choice I believed would save China. I live with the consequences. But he never visited the flood sites. He never met with survivors. He never looked at the cost up close. When the Japanese realized what had happened, they were initially confused. Their intelligence reports indicated the dike had been breached, but they didn't immediately understand it was deliberate. When they figured it out, they used it for propaganda. Look at what the Chinese government does to its own people, Japanese broadcasts declared. They distributed leaflets to Chinese civilians. Your government has murdered you. Surrender to Japan and be protected. It was cynical. The Japanese were committing their own atrocities across China, but it was also effective propaganda. Some Chinese civilians, devastated by the flood, did lose faith in their government. The nationalist government struggled to counter the narrative because it was true. They had killed their own people. Military historians have long debated, were there alternatives? Could the nationalists have slowed the Japanese without flooding the plains? Some possibilities: scorched earth tactics, burn crops, destroy infrastructure, deny resources to the Japanese without mass civilian death. Strategic bombing of Japanese supply lines, target logistics instead of creating a flood. Guerrilla warfare, use the terrain for asymmetric resistance. All of these were discussed. All were rejected as insufficient. Chiang's advisors believed only a dramatic action, something that would physically block the Japanese advance, would work. But here's the thing: they didn't seriously try other options first. The flood was chosen not because it was the only option, but because it was the fastest. One historian noted, they wanted a quick fix, a dramatic gesture. They didn't think through the long-term consequences. Or maybe they did, and they decided civilian lives were acceptable losses. The Yellow River flood raises uncomfortable questions that remain relevant today. When is it acceptable to sacrifice civilians for military objectives? Modern warfare still grapples with this. Drone strikes that cause collateral damage, sieges that starve cities, bombings that destroy infrastructure. The flood was an extreme example, but the underlying question persists. How many civilian deaths are acceptable to achieve a military goal? International law has evolved since 1938, the Geneva Conventions, rules of war, but they're often violated. And when they are, governments justify it the same way Chiang did: military necessity. The Yellow River flood stands as a warning. When you justify atrocities with necessity, you lose your moral authority, and history will judge you. Let's put the numbers in context. The Yellow River flood killed 400,000 to 900,000 people. Here are other World War II death tolls for comparison. Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined, around 200 to 300,000. The Blitz, London bombing, around 40,000. Dresden firebombing, around 25,000. Pearl Harbor, around 2,400. The Yellow River flood killed more civilians than many of the most famous events of World War II. Yet it's barely mentioned in Western history books. Why? Several reasons. It happened in China, which received less Western media coverage. It was done by an allied government, not an enemy, making it politically inconvenient. It was a flood, not a bombing or battle, so it doesn't fit neat narrative categories. The victims were peasants, not soldiers or famous cities. History remembers what's dramatic, what's photogenic, what fits the story we want to tell. The Yellow River flood doesn't fit, so it's forgotten.
The Yellow River flood isn't even China's only forgotten mass casualty event. Consider the Great Chinese Famine, 1959 to 1961, caused by Mao's Great Leap Forward policies. Death toll, 15 to 55 million. The Taiping Rebellion, 1850 to 1864, a civil war that killed 20 to 30 million. The 1931 China floods killed 1 to 4 million people. China has experienced some of the deadliest disasters in human history, and most of them are unknown outside China, and sometimes even within China, if they're politically sensitive. The Yellow River flood sits among these forgotten tragedies, too big to ignore, too uncomfortable to remember. This isn't unique to China. Around the world, certain atrocities are forgotten while others are remembered. The Bengal famine, 1943. British policies contributed to a famine that killed 2 to 3 million Indians, barely taught in Britain. The Holodomor, 1932 to 1933. Soviet policies caused a famine in Ukraine that killed 3 to 5 million, suppressed for decades. The Armenian Genocide, 1915. 1.5 million Armenians killed, still denied by Turkey. King Leopold's Congo, 1885 to 1908. 10 million Congolese killed, rarely taught in European schools. The pattern is clear. Atrocities committed by our side or by governments still in power are forgotten. Atrocities committed by enemies are remembered and emphasized. History isn't objective, it's political. The Yellow River flood is forgotten the same reason these other tragedies are. Remembering them is uncomfortable. As of 2024, there are perhaps a handful of survivors still alive. They're all over 90, most are over 100. One of them, we'll call her Grandmother Chen, lives in a small apartment in Jiangsu. She was 6 years old when the flood hit.
She remembers everything. I remember my mother's face when the water came. She knew we were going to die. She held me and my brother, and she prayed. We climbed onto the roof. My brother fell off. My mother jumped in after him. I never saw them again. Grandmother Chen was rescued by fishermen 3 days later. She was raised by distant relatives who survived. For 80 years, she didn't talk about it. Who would listen, she asks. Who would care? But now, at 92, she started speaking. Because she's the last one. When she dies, the living memory dies with her. I need someone to know, she says. I need the world to know. My mother died. My brother died. Hundreds of thousands died. They can't be forgotten. I won't let them be forgotten. She keeps a notebook with names, family members, neighbors, people from her village. When I die, she says, someone needs to take this book. Someone needs to remember their names. What we owe the dead. The Yellow River flood challenges us to ask, what do we owe the forgotten dead? They didn't die in a valiant battle. They didn't sacrifice themselves heroically. They were murdered by their own government, drowned in the name of strategy. Do we remember them? Or do we let them fade because their story is uncomfortable? History isn't just about what happened. It's about what we choose to remember. And forgetting isn't neutral. Forgetting is a choice. When we forget atrocities, we make them easier to repeat. When we forget the victims, we strip them of their humanity a second time. The people who died in the Yellow River flood weren't statistics. They were farmers, teachers, children, grandmothers. They had names, lives, dreams. They deserved better than to drown in a flood their own government created. And they deserve better than to be forgotten. Today, the Yellow River still flows. The land has recovered, mostly. The villages have been rebuilt, some of them. But the scars remain. In the soil, in the landscape, and in the memories of the families who survived. The flood changed China in ways that are still felt today. It eroded trust between the government and the people. It demonstrated that in war, civilian lives can be sacrificed for strategy. It set a precedent. Necessity justifies anything. That precedent echoes through history. Every time a government says we had no choice, remember the Yellow River. Every time civilian deaths are dismissed as acceptable losses, remember the Yellow River. Every time we're told to move on, to forget, to focus on the future, remember. Because the dead can't speak for themselves. We have to speak for them. In June 1938, the Yellow River became a weapon. It killed hundreds of thousands of people. And then the world forgot. But we don't have to. We can remember. We can speak their names. We can refuse to let their deaths be meaningless. The Yellow River flood wasn't a natural disaster. It was a choice. And every choice has consequences. The consequences of this choice rippled through generations. They're still rippling today. This is their story. This is what happened. This is what we must never forget.